Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being here today, and a special thank you to the ranking member of the Veterans Affairs Committee, Senator Tester, and to Senators Nelson and Blumenthal for speaking out on this incredibly important issue. The president made one promise during his campaign that meant more than any to veterans, and that was that he was going to protect them. Yet his signature action as president, his one thing that he's managed to get accomplished, this health care law passing out of the House, he immediately betrays them. House Republicans voted on their health care repeal bill last week without even knowing how much it would cost or how many millions of Americans would be forced to pay more for less coverage. We might not have a CBO score yet, but it is abundantly clear that Trumpcare will kick millions of Americans off of their health insurance and force millions more to pay higher out-of-pocket costs. We've been hearing a lot about this plan's flaws over the last few weeks, but most people don't know about one of the biggest problems buried deep within Trumpcare. Despite his campaign pledge to support our veterans, President Trump's signature health care repeal legislation actually includes a veterans tax. He's going to increase taxes on veterans, and it could affect as many as 8 million of our warriors and make it harder for them to be able to afford health insurance. This tax wouldn't just make veterans pay a few extra dollars, it would force them to pay thousands of dollars extra each year. You see, Trumpcare prohibits any veteran who is eligible for VA health care from receiving tax credits to help them afford insurance in the private market. The thing is, there's a big difference between being eligible for VA health care and being enrolled in it. There are about 8 million Americans who've served in uniform and are therefore eligible for veterans care, but who never enroll in VA. Why? Well, some veterans live far away from a VA facility in rural communities that don't have a VA office. Others prefer to rely on their private health insurance. Many more want to go to VA, are eligible for VA, have been told by VA they're eligible, but are banned and prohibited from going to VA, and it because of means testing, which in part in Illinois affects as much as $30,000. So veterans who make in Illinois, for example, as little as $30,000 who qualify for VA care are not allowed to enroll in VA due to VA means testing. I'll give you an example. My brother, who lives in Nevada, served in the United States Coast Guard for 8 years, served honorably, has been deemed eligible for VA health care, but because he makes more than $30,000 as a Harley-Davidson mechanic, is not eligible to go to VA for that health care. That is simply wrong. Still, more veterans only qualify to get VA care for their service-connected injuries. So a paratrooper who hurts his ankle, say he breaks his ankle on a jump in Iraq or Afghanistan, can only go to VA for that broken ankle and then the health care associated with that ankle. The rest of his body, the VA will not care for unless he is 100% disabled. That means that they have to take on the responsibility of their own health care. Trumpcare threatens to rip health care out of their hands. When I first learned about this anti-veteran provision that Speaker Ryan tried to hide in the so-called technical amendment back in March, he gave his caucus just a few hours to figure out what was in the bill. So with so little warning, you can't really blame them for not knowing what was in this bill, in that bill. But that doesn't explain what happened last week. They knew about the flaw. They tried to hide the flaw. We told them about the flaw. They went back and rewrote their bill, and they put it right back in. They knowingly decided to raise taxes on veterans and put veterans out on the streets without health care. And for a president who is infamous for breaking his promises, this is a new low. Supporting our veterans should not be a Republican issue or a Democratic issue. It certainly isn't for me. President Trump promised to improve care for veterans, but we now know he's willing to endanger millions of veterans who risk their lives to defend our nation. Apparently, 217 House Republicans are as well. The question left is, what will Senate Republicans do? With that, I'd like to introduce my colleague, the ranking member of the Veterans Affairs Committee and a true champion for veterans, Senator Jon Tester of Montana. I'm going to back up this way.
Yep. Well, thank you, Senator Duckworth. It is a pleasure to be here with you and Senator Nelson and Senator Blumenthal today. As many of you know, if not all of you know, I come from a rural state, second highest per capita in the country for veterans, over 1 in 10. There's 110,000 veterans, 1 million people. And I point out the fact that it's a rural state because I think it's really important on this issue. The state that, by the way, has the most veterans per capita is Alaska, another very rural state. Tammy talked about the tax credit issue, and I think it's a very, very important issue where we're going to raise taxes on veterans and quite frankly, take away benefits for serving through this bill that passed the House. But I also want to point out that because this bill throws off millions of Americans off of health care, and rural America is no exception, it puts our rural hospitals at risk. This is an incredibly difficult situation because as we try to make the choice program works, which allows veterans to be able to access health care in the private sector, those small medical facilities are critically important. And if their charity care goes up, like it will under this bill, those healthcare facilities who have a very, very, very small margin, and I know this because I've talked to them since Election Day, will be forced to close. And quite frankly, that'll take away options for everybody, including our veterans. It is a huge problem in rural America, and it is a problem that we need to be cognizant of, as I'm sure that this bill will try to be jammed through the Senate. Most importantly, though, I think that we have a promise to uphold to our veterans in this country. And for those veterans that have not been enrolled in the VA and get this tax credit, we're not fulfilling, not even beginning to fulfill that promise because it takes that tax credit away. Our veterans deserve better. I think this bill is a very poorly written piece of legislation. I would love to tell you that I think the Senate's going to fix it, but I think it's got so much wrong with it that we ought to go back to what we initially started, and that is take the Affordable Care Act, take the things in it that work, keep them, and fix the things in it that are wrong. And if we were able to do that, it would fix this problem. With that, I have the incredible honor to introduce somebody who represents the state of Florida so very, very well, a good friend of mine, Senator Nelson from Florida.
Thanks, John. And that's the problem that what John is talking about. In order to fix the law so that it's operating in the best for everybody, you ought to take the current law and what needs fixing, fix it. But you got to do that in a bipartisan fashion. And you see that this new administration and the leadership of both houses in the majority decided that they want to do it on their own with only Republican votes. And that's when you get in trouble. And that's exactly what happened over in the House. They wanting to ram something through, wanting, because of reconciliation, to avoid having to go back to the Veterans Committee. And so this is exactly what they've done. And now they have created a situation where there are 7 or 8 million veterans in this country who are eligible for VA care in limited circumstances, as Tammy described, but who do not do that health care through VA. So they ought to then have the opportunity to get their health care through the exchanges and to be able to get the subsidies or the tax credits. But no, what they did to make this just a partisan Republican health care bill, they rammed it through, and they have created this unjustifiable and inexcusable, and I expect when veterans find out about this that there's going to be some outcry as we are now telling the story. So these brave men and women who have served our country should be eligible for the same subsidies and tax credits as any other American gets. And they're not getting it in this Republican health care bill. Now it's my great opportunity to give you one of the smartest attorneys in the U.S. Senate, Senator Richard Blumenthal.
Thank you. Thanks, Bill. Thank you, Senator Nelson. And I'm really proud to stand here with Senator Duckworth, a real American hero and a champion for veterans, so courageous and strong. Thank you, Senator, for bringing us together, and my great friends and warriors, Senator Tester and Senator Nelson. You know, why are we not surprised, really? After the extraordinary show that President Trump conducted at the VA just a week or so ago, healthcare is going to be better than ever, beautiful. And what does Trumpcare do? Yank tax credits away from veterans, unlike any other Americans. Veterans are simply not going to stand for this double talk and deception. And this measure is the height of hypocrisy. It ought to be a call to action for every veteran and every veteran service organization across the United States. They ought to be angry as hell. Every veteran should be angry as hell at this hypocrisy and the double talk and deception that Donald Trump is trying to sell to the American people. The ultimate hypocrisy here, and the irony is, we are seeking in a bipartisan way to offer more choices to veterans, give them more opportunities outside the VA health care system. That's the future of VA health care. And we're doing it through the Veterans Choice Program, which is being extended beyond 2017. There's bipartisan support for it. I have co-sponsored that measure and helped to lead it with Senator Tester and others like members of the Veterans Affairs Committee. There's bipartisan support for measures that encourage veterans to seek health care outside the Veterans Administration. And what is the first thing that Trumpcare does? Eliminate the incentives and the tax credits for working through that program and for seeking care outside the program. This measure also treats post-traumatic stress as a pre-existing condition, which, in my view, is just an insult to veterans who have served and bear the invisible wounds of war. I cannot tell you how ashamed I am to think that the United States Senate might approve a health care measure that regards post-traumatic stress as a pre-existing condition. Ashamed and angry, and so should be, I hope, veterans across America. Thank you.
We'll take some questions.
Senator, is there an easy fix to this? Do you think you can work with your Republican colleagues over here and just insert some of the language back in and get around this?
Well, the ironic thing is that the fix was in the original version of this bill. It was the same language. It was in the Affordable Care Act, was in the American Health Care Act in the original version, and the Republicans took it out. They took it out in the middle of the night and tried to hide that fact by putting it in the technical amendment, and said that they took it out knowing that it would be a problem. And so we raised the flag and said, look, you need to put the protection back in. And when they came back with this new version of the healthcare law that they passed, it still was not in there. So they knew about the problem. In fact, they put in the protections in the first version of the law and took it out and tried to hide the fact that they took away these protections for veterans and that they were going to be raising taxes on veterans.
So you don't see this as an oversight or an accident anymore? This is
Oh, it was never an oversight or an accident. In fact, why else would they have the language in the correct language in the law in the first place to protect veterans specifically, and then hide the fact that they took it out in the technical amendment. And then after we raised the flag on it, failed to put in that correct language in this version. Yes.
Hey, so just to clarify, thanks so much for this. Chairman Rowe of the House VA committee went to the floor and said that, this in no way changes existing regulations that allow a veteran eligible but not enrolled in the VA from using a tax credit to purchase health insurance. So what is the exact conflict that you guys are having that contrasts with what Mr. Rowe said?
It actually does do that. Under the Affordable Care Act, there was language in it that specifically dealt with the Affordable Care Act that said that veterans who are eligible for VA care are exempt from the provision from having to get their care at VA, and that they can use the tax credits. It's within the IRS code. What happened was this bill repeals the Affordable Care Act, which means that rule on the IRS no longer applies. And because of that, they have to put in their own language, just as the Affordable Care Act put in that language to protect veterans specifically. Because you see, veterans qualify for VA health care, but many of them don't use VA health care, up to 8 million of them. Some of them not because of choice, but because they live too far away to get to a VA facility, or the VA doesn't even allow them. The VA says, you qualify, but you can't have access to this VA hospital, this clinic. You can't have access to Veterans Choice because you make too much money. You make more than $30,000 a year.
So was Chairman Rowe just speaking untruthfully on the floor, or?
You will have to ask him that, because in the original version of the bill that they put off, the original version of the bill before the technical amendment, the language had been put in there to protect veterans, and they took it out. They hid the fact that they took it out in the middle of the night in a technical language, and then tried to cover that up. Yeah.
Senator, have you had discussions with Republican leadership on this side about this issue, and if so, what's been their response on it?
Well, I think this conversation should be happening in the Veterans Affairs Committee. I'm going to turn it over to Senator Tester to talk about this, because I don't sit on the Veterans Affairs Committee.
A couple things. First of all, to go to the preceding question, I just want to tell you that this is what happens when you push things through with no committee hearing, with no ability for amendments, with no ability basically for input. And I don't think Phil Rowe went to the floor and said anything that he thought was wrong, but this is what happens when you do things this quickly, okay? As far as where we're going to go from here, we don't even know yet what bill is going to be introduced yet. We're talking about the one from the House, and if this bill's a train wreck on so many different fronts, including for our veterans. And so once we know what we're dealing with, hopefully we can end up with a bill that increases accessibility and affordability and for our veterans. But I think what's really criminal, quite frankly, about all this is that they have put a bill through the House that obviously is not very well thought through. And we've had so many conversations. We've had choice fix bills. We're going to have another choice fix bill in the fall. And as Tammy said, originally was in the bill, then it was taken out. It does make you wonder where the priorities are for this. If the priorities were just for the tax breaks for the incredibly elite in our society, or if it really was about health care.
You know, since I've been introduced as a lawyer with exaggerated credentials, let me explain what I think may be the confusion, and it may be a legitimate confusion on Congressman Rowe's part. He may believe sincerely that the IRS rule survives. The IRS rule was not explicitly revoked or repealed, but the rule depends on a provision in the Affordable Care Act. The IRS can't just make up rules. They need a law that they're implementing. And the rule was not explicitly repealed, but the law was. So the law being repealed means that the rule is dead as well. And that's where I think maybe the confusion is on his part. But I don't, as Senator Duckworth said, we can't speak for him. What we know is that veterans certainly will lose this tax credit, if there is no IRS rule, which in turn depends on a law that has been repealed.
This is what happens when, in the dead of night, you try to do something in secret and do it with only one party.
Senator Duckworth, who specifically were you communicating with? Rose staff or Speaker Ryan's staff?
Well, this information was relayed on the House side by the ranking member of the House Veterans Affairs Committee, Tim Walz. And we were here in this room bringing this to everyone's attention back in March that this was going to be a problem. Remember, the original House bill specifically had language putting in the protection. And then in the technical amendment that they pushed through in the middle of the night and said, oh, there's nothing there, don't worry about it, there's nothing significant there, and they hid the fact that they took this rule out, and that would affect veterans. And when we raised the red flag and pointed it out to them, what did they do on the new version of the bill that they just pushed through? They put that same language in there where the veterans now no longer qualify and will see a tax increase.
One kind of on topic, one off topic. First, I'm curious what your thoughts are looking at the Senate. Republicans now working this forward. They have a working group of 13 white men. Do you have any concerns as we try and improve this bill that basically there's no diversity in at least the main working group on the GOP side?
Well, I am always concerned when there is a lack of diversity in any group. We as a nation are a diverse nation, and our military certainly reflects that. Our military could not go to war and protect this nation without its women and without its members of different religious, ethnic, cultural, gender identity backgrounds. And so to have a group that is not reflective or even in a single way of the people who they're trying to protect. It's a problem. It's a problem. There are issues within VA healthcare that I've been working on for a long time that have to do with fertility. Female veterans have far higher infertility rate than male veterans. The VA's prohibition against third-party donations for fertility treatment actually affects so many of our young men, our warriors, who have lost their reproductive organs stepping on landmines. And so they need third-party donations in order to conceive and start a child. The VA is not allowed to do that. There are many health issues that tie directly to people of different racial backgrounds that are not brought up. Asians have higher cases of liver cancer, for example. So it's a real problem when you don't have that diversity. Not to say that my esteemed colleagues can't pay attention, but when you're not in the room, it's really hard to raise some of those issues. Thank you.
Senator Duckworth, kind of a related question too. There's some talk of adding some 3,000 ground troops to Afghanistan. Will that take some of the load off the special operations troops, or what are your thoughts on that?
Well, my deep concern is that it seems like the president, who's the commander-in-chief of our great military, seems to not want to be doing his job as commander-in-chief and is shifting the decision-making process onto the military commanders in the Pentagon. I think he needs to do his job as a commander-in-chief. I have been talking for a very long time, urging both President Obama and now President Trump to allow us to debate an AUMF, an authorization for use of military force. If the White House won't do their job, if President Trump won't do his job as commander-in-chief in making these key decisions and shifting them off into the Pentagon, then I will make sure that here in the Senate we have those discussions. After all, our men and women who serve in uniform deserve to know what we expect them to do, under what conditions, what those parameters are. It's also important, that's why we're here discussing this today, for them to know that the American people are behind them. That young man or woman who's about to go into Afghanistan should not be second guessing, am I going to get hurt on this deployment? And if I do, am I not going to be eligible for VA health care? Am I going to see a tax increase on my family because now I qualify for VA care, but I can't go to VA? What does that do to them? So our warriors deserve far better than they're getting from the Trump administration, whether it is from a commander-in-chief who's not willing to do his job as commander-in-chief and shifting the blame, the responsibility, the authorization onto the Pentagon, or for a White House that pushed through a health care bill that will actually increase taxes on veterans and make them ineligible for key portions of health care.
Let me just add a word
Yeah.
on that, because I have been a strong supporter of the authorization for use of military force. We've seen this movie before. The commitment of ground troops, escalating engagement without congressional oversight sufficient to assure that the mission is defined and that the American people authorize the action. That's why we need an authorization of military force to make sure that the mission is defined, that the military is responsive, and that the President of the United States comes to us and gets the American people to approve of what he is doing when he is conducting a war. For the Obama administration, as well as this one, we've urged that there be an authorization of military force. And the commitment of additional ground troops is a very ominous sign of what is to come and what is necessary for the Congress to do if we're going to have this escalating commitment. And I'm a strong supporter of the military. I've just come from a hearing on the Armed Services Committee where I serve. I am sympathetic to the goals that the military is trying to advance in Iraq and Afghanistan of fighting ISIS. We need to keep our eye on the ball. We are fighting ISIS because we are protecting the homeland. And that's why the authorization of military force is essential to define what that mission is.
Senator Blumenthal, are you concerned that FBI Director Comey misspoke before the Judiciary Committee when it comes to the Clinton emails and the Avenue?
I'd be happy to talk to you about that. That's really not why we're here today.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.